Hey guys, welcome to another Bob Ross and the Art of Guitar video. And this week I'm going live. Um, last week I unfortunately didn't post up a video. There's been a lot of things that are going on, and the planning on my part wasn't the best, so I didn't get to make a video for last week. So I apologize for that. Hopefully, you guys went back and checked out some of the other videos. But for this week, what I want to talk about is something that's brought up a great deal across the different platforms, social media platforms that I'm on, and that's the topic of comping. And I can tell you that for me, I'm a person that is very analytical about things. And I remember when I was first trying to figure out how to comp, at least in the jazz style, I had no clue. And I kept trying to figure it out by using very logical approaches. And that can be done. And I'm actually going to go over a few things that work out really well, at least in my opinion, that work really well in doing that. But I couldn't understand how it was that you were supposed to comp behind someone. So for me, it took a long time to try to really figure out some sort of an approach or way to handle that. So what I like to do is share with you guys 6 different ways of approaching the topic. And these are going to be not really in-depth approaches. I'm not going to go through each one and get really involved with it. Although I do plan on making at least a video or two in the coming weeks to address a few of these topics and actually show you how I apply it on the guitar. So what I'd like to start with is this. In order to comp, in order to be adequate at providing some sort of a harmonic structure behind a soloist or a vocalist, another instrument that's playing, even yourself, comping for yourself, it's good to know an array of chords across the guitar. So that would include getting your basic triads down. That would also be your sevenths, and all the in-betweens that go in there too, whether it's and I'm talking about inversions and everything. Making sure you know the inversions, that you can go through all 12 keys, going through and practicing diatonic triads, diatonic sevenths, being able to take a chord and just put it through the different formulaic approaches, such as major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, all of those as well. You should have a really good grasp on those. If you don't, then you're going to find yourself sort of limited on what you're able to do on the guitar. So the more that you can get involved with that, the more that you can understand the chords across the fretboard, and the more that you have under your fingers, the better. That way you don't have to struggle to use or to find voices that work where you're at currently. If you're comping behind someone, you don't have to go to that same old voicing that and jump up and down across the fretboard. So make sure that you have a really good grasp on the fundamentals. That's step number one. Another thing that you could do is practice harmonizing melodies. And this is like the chord melody approach. So when you're learning a tune, I think that a lot of us, and at least for me for a long time, what I would do is I would learn a tune and go through and just play the melody by itself, play the chord by itself. And then an instructor of mine brought it to my attention, hey, why don't you do both? Why don't you play the melody and harmonize it? And in doing that, I started to jot down, and I highly recommend this, I started to jot down voicings. I got a chord diagram sheet, and I started writing down a bunch of voicings that I was finding as I was harmonizing the melody. And there's multiple ways that you can harmonize the melody. For those of us who use fake books, real books, some sort of a lead sheet, you see some very basic chords that are suggested. But what you want to do is explore that more. Sure, it says F minor 7, and okay, how about you maybe try an F minor 6, or just use an F minor triad, or why don't you try an F minor 11 or a 13? It all depends on the melody too, so you got to be careful of that. But think about some other ways that you can approach just the basic chords that are given. So that will help a great deal as well. Now, as far as like the next thing, after harmonizing, after getting, basic chords, harmonizing, which is really going to solidify some of those basic chord voicings to make sure that you have a good grasp of a number of those that you can use to your disposal. Then what I would do is use voice leading. And I'm going to break this down, and you notice I keep looking down because I made some notes here based on my experience. What I would do for the voice leading part of this is break it into like three sections. So, uh, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, when you voice lead, you're trying to find movement from one chord to another chord that makes it so it leads really well. Now, there's the classical approach to voice leading, and there's the rules that you could follow, and it, to study that and get a good understanding of that is useful as well. In general, when you're playing, if you have a voicing that you're using and you're going to go to another chord, then what I would suggest that you do is try to find the least amount of movement that you have to do. Are there common tones? Can you keep some common notes in there and move only what you need to move? The only thing you have to be careful with, at least in my experience with that, is that if there is no reference, if there is no bass player, then some of the voicings could overlap and you actually wouldn't have to move any note at all. And if that's the case, maybe it's not the best sound. Maybe you want to try to play around with some of the other notes and maybe put some extensions in there or do something in order to, spice up the comping a bit, the chord choice. So be aware of that in a comping situation where you have like a bass player behind you. That type of thing's really not so much of a big deal, but just keep that little piece of information in mind when you're comping and trying to voice lead. But here we go. As far as the steps that I break it into, why don't you try to move one note? So start at the lower end. You can start anywhere on the guitar, but what I like to do is start on the lower end of the instrument. Start at the bottom and use a voicing for a chord. Even and for example, like a chord progression, why not the blues? So if you take the blues and you start at the lower end of the fretboard, pick a chord that you know. Let's say you're a B flat blues. Pick a B flat 7 voicing that you know, and then you don't have to just hold it out for 4 counts, and then another 4, depending on how you're going to approach the changes to it. If you're going to keep it like a really basic 1-4-5, or if you're going to do more of a hyped up version of it, that's really your choice on that. But when you first go through, maybe every time there's a new chord that needs to happen, you move the chord to the next chord and you voice lead, trying to keep that upper note moving only maybe a half step, at the most a whole step up. Now, when you get a little bit more comfortable with that, then what I would do is if I had a chord that's going to sit for a measure, 2 measures at a time, then start to think, well, can I start moving that up a little bit and keeping that top note moving up by half step or a whole step as well. It's kind of a challenge. I mean, in the beginning, you're going to start to discover voicings that you didn't think about before, but it's something that will expand your chord vocabulary. And what you could do, like I've said before earlier, is that you want to take chord diagram and a page of blank chord diagrams and start jotting these down, because most likely as you go through this you're going to start forgetting these, and jot those down so you have a reference on some ideas that you had and some voicings you came up with that work really well. The second step would be like what I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is move to the next closest voicing, going from chord to chord. Keep everything as close as possible. Keep those common tones in there. And if 2 chords actually share the voicing you've chosen, if they share a good bit of the chord tones, then maybe alter some of the chord tones a bit, maybe add an extension in there. Once again, I mean, you have to be careful when you put it in context behind comping behind someone. you have to be careful about throwing in some of the extensions or alterations because that may sound out of place. I mean, the overall idea of comping is to complement, whether you're backing a vocalist, another instrument soloist, whatever. Uh, you don't want to overstep your boundaries. So be careful of that. But when you're practicing on your own, then it's wide open. You can add those extensions in there to spice it up a little bit. If the common tones are so close, the chords are sharing so much information, you're not really hearing a difference, then, try to add some alterations in there or extensions. And then the third um, approach that you could take under the voice leading is to keep a note the same, like keeping the top note of the chord the same. Can you go through a tune and keep that top note pretty much in the same, right on that same note? And yes, this is where those extensions or alterations come into play pretty strongly, because in some cases that's the only way to get that note to stay the same. If you do have to move the top note, then maybe move the note only down a half step or up a half step. So don't start jumping, and using wider intervals than that. And as soon as you can move to that next chord, if it incorporates that original top note, put it back. Move that voicing back. Now, number 4, compose a melody. So go through a tune and compose a simple melody and voice your way through that. Just like what you do with chord melodies, where you're harmonizing the melody. Think of adding some sort of a counter melody to what's going on. So jot down something, don't make it too complex, but jot down something that could act as a counter melody to harmonize the melody that's going by, and then fill it in. Start to add some harmonic structure to that and build some chords upon that. Because when you are comping behind someone, at least for me, I had an instructor that pointed this out to me in undergrad. He said, when you're thinking about comping behind someone, think about using a counter melody, or a counterpoint of some sorts as well too. But using something that can complement what's going on, but also creates like another melody that's going by. Don't get locked into all the chord voicings, but think about how you can create a melody in itself as well. This really will start to come out more in, at least for me, I find in solo playing, that right there, just trying to do something like that is huge. That will make a big impact on your solo playing. Trying to harmonize the melodies and the lines that you're creating, it takes a long time, in the beginning. But I, once again, grab some blank chord diagrams and jot down some of the ideas that you had come up with, and keep a list of that going. You don't have to memorize them. Some people like to do that. You don't have to memorize them. I never did that. I didn't go back and memorize them all and kept trying to use them. It's just for me, taking what I was seeing on the fretboard, internalizing it, and then jotting it down helped to solidify some of that information for me. Now, number 5, think outside the box. And this is coming from a saxophone player that, so if you're watching my videos on YouTube, you've seen some of the videos I post up with a saxophonist named Dan Barger. Dan Barger and I played together a long time, and Dan's a great sax player, and he done something, I started to notice this in Philly. I had an instructor that was doing this, but it wasn't until Dan and I started playing together that I noticed that when I was soloing, he was starting to play single note lines back behind me. So he was comping to the ability of what he was able to do on his instrument, because he's not playing chords. Although Dan does like to use pedals, and he can put those out there too. But when we're just playing together and he's keeping it, just a saxophone, he will comp behind me. And that, once again, the first time that I noticed something like that was in Philly. I had an instructor named Ben Schachter. If you don't know Ben Schachter, please check out his music. He's a phenomenal tenor player. I noticed that when we were in improv class, we would take solos, and he said, guitar players, don't comp. Piano players, don't comp. Don't use chords. Use single note lines and try to comp behind the other person. Don't get in their way. Just try to complement what they're doing. And then he would do it. He would give us an example. That blew my mind the first time that he done that, because my role, I always felt, was, well, I got to play these, standard chords that I know, and I don't know what else to do. So if you're new to that, you've never done that, don't get too frustrated with it. Just allow space. Try to be very open to what you're listening to. And a great way to work on that would be put on some of your favorite recordings of soloists, single note line players, and try to play back behind them. And see if you can do that just using single note lines. Don't overcomplicate it. Resist trying to play full on chords back behind them. And finally, the last thing, number 6, listen. Listen to a lot of guitarists, pianists, listen to even drummers, bassists, even like what I was talking about with Ben Schachter and Dan, instrumentalists that do comp behind people, those instrumentalists that do not have the ability to play chords. Check out what they're doing. You know, uh, I can give you a couple that really has opened up my ears and that I really keep going back to. For guitar, it'd be John Stoll, and Jim Hall is another. I really dig what Jonathan Kreisberg does, what Ben Monder does, Mike Marino. I know I'm naming some newer players. There's tons of older players too, old school players that I dig too. These are the guys that I currently listen to on a regular basis, and I keep listening to how they're doing it. One that's kind of caught my attention at first was that it's a little bit different approach. Adam Rogers. I listen to what Adam Rogers does, and I don't hear him doing a lot of full-on comping, although I know he does from time to time. But if you're in a situation where you're in a trio and you're the only instrument that has that function to comp, so like a bass, guitar, drum trio, check out what Adam Rogers does. I mean, he plays like little, 2 note, 3, 4 note voicings, just simple stuff to comp while he's playing. Kreisberg done the same thing. I always dug that. I thought first time I heard that, that that was one of those other things that was just an eye-opening thing to me. I didn't realize that. I kept thinking, man, I gotta play full-on chords. No, I don't. I can just play like simple voicings, and this is kind of like those shell voicings, thirds and sevenths, or maybe throwing in like I don't know, root third, ninth, some extension. Try some different things out. So those are just some ideas that and thoughts that I have on comping, and some things that I have come to think about more over time in my experience in playing in situations where I comp behind a vocalist. Other guitar players, bassists, even doing duos with drummers, me and a sax player. Those are just some ideas that I have, and like I said, over the coming weeks, I plan on to address these a little bit more in detail and actually apply it to the guitar and show you where I'm coming from and give some examples. So I hope you guys find this useful and you apply it in your practice. Please don't forget to subscribe. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day and a great rest of your week. Thanks for watching.